Hello, everyone. Welcome back to day 7 of the camp. Hope you guys are all doing well. So, as you've seen on the slide, firstly for today on the agenda is we'll be reviewing the first tactic we learned yesterday, which is the pin. And then we'll be looking at our second tactic of the week, which is the fork. We'll go through some examples like yesterday. And then at the end, we'll do some practice where we'll split into breakout rooms and things, and we'll practice the second tactic, which is the fork. So, like I mentioned, I'll share my screen and we'll quickly do some review on the pin, and then we'll move on to learning the second tactic. I'll make this screen slightly bigger. Okay. Okay, so this is black to move. This one is a little bit tricky. I'll say for this one, we have to look for the most forcing moves for black. So forcing moves including checks, captures, and attacks.
Rook to A1.
Yep, okay. Rook to A1 is indeed the correct first move. So what is the follow-up after white's move?
Queen, queen to B2.
Queen to B2, that's a great try. However, queen to B2 isn't the best move. I understand we're taking advantage that this rook is no longer defending this pawn. However, with this rook here on the first rank, there is a different well, basically this pin can be exploited in a different way. The hint is, I guess, what was the rook defending before? Because when it's in a pin, obviously the rook can't move off of the last rank. So what was the rook defending before it was on the last rank?
The queen.
Yep. So if we know now that the queen is the piece that was defended before the rook was in a pin, if the rook is in a pin now, that means, so what does that mean?
Well, we can capture the queen.
Yep, nicely done. That is correct. Queen takes f7 is indeed the correct move. So this one was a little bit tricky. So the idea was that basically in this position, after we give a check, white only has one legal move because the king is completely boxed in by his own pieces and it only has the back rank available. And once the rook goes back, you'll see that this rook is pinning this rook, so it can't go off of the back rank. And so basically that means that this queen is completely undefended. Although it looks like it's defended by this rook, it isn't because it's in a sense a fake defender because it can't move off the back rank like I mentioned. So here we're able to take the queen. White does get a rook, but however, we still have a queen, so we should be able to win. Okay, next example. This is black to move. Okay, the hint I'll give for this one is that basically we have a light squared bishop, so we want to envision sort of what types of pins we can do. So you'll see that the king is already on a light square in the corner, and you'll see that if our bishop gets to this diagonal in some form, there could be a pin that our bishop could give. And also another hint I'll give is that tactics, like I mentioned before yesterday, they usually start with some form of sacrifice.
Bishop to d5.
That's a great try. Bishop to d5, that indeed does get the bishop on this diagonal. However, the bishop, unfortunately, on f3 is able to take this bishop on d5. So if we know that the bishop on f3 can take the bishop on d5, how can we make it so that A, there is no bishop on the board, or B, the bishop can't take the bishop on d5.
Take the bishop with the rook.
Yep, that is correct. So after rook takes bishop, what's the correct follow-up here?
You pin the rook by moving bishop to d5.
Right, yes. Nicely done. So that is indeed the correct sequence. So obviously this bishop on f3, it prevents bishop to d5 right now. But after we take the bishop, you realize that now we can play bishop to d5, and there's no bishop here to take our bishop on d5. And you realize that since you already took a bishop initially for our rook, and we're gaining back the rook after, we're basically able to win a bishop in this whole exchange. So after let's move, we can simply take this rook. And the king can't come up to protect this rook because that square is defended by the pawn. Okay, we'll do one more and then we'll move on to the tactic for today. Once again, this is black to move. Nope, sorry. It seems I can't hear you that well. Would you mind typing it in the chat? Knight f3 is indeed correct. Nicely done. So the idea with knight f3 is it takes advantage of this pin right here to a king on h2. The g pawn can't take because then the rook would take the king. And this actually is a pretty nice segue into what we're learning today. So here for black, what is the correct follow-up?
Rook to d1.
Yep, rook to d1 is indeed correct. Some of you might have noticed there's actually a bishop hanging here on e5, but you realize with rook to d1, we actually get checkmate with black because knight covers h2, and that means the king can't get off of the last rank. And after rook to d1, you realize that, well, the knight has the block, and then we simply take the knight, and this is actually indeed checkmate. And also the reason why I say this is a nice segue into what we're learning today is because this is also the tactic that we're learning, which is the fork, where we attack basically two pieces at the same time. But however, in this instance, we don't actually take the bishop because rook d1 leads to checkmate. Okay, nice. Good to know you guys still remember the pin as well as how it works. So today, like I just mentioned, let me quickly share my screen. We'll be looking at the next tactic, which is the fork. So I'll quickly explain what a fork is. So a fork in chess is basically a tactic where we attack two pieces, like I mentioned, at the exact same time with one piece. And usually these two pieces that we're attacking are either completely undefended, or they're defended by a, or they're defended, but we're using a piece that's attacking the piece. Well, basically, or the piece is defended, but we're using a singular piece that is of lower value to attack two pieces of higher value. So I'll show that really quickly. So, for example, in this instance, this is an instance where like two pieces are undefended. And here we can, black actually has a fork. I'll flip the board, make it easier. So here, black can play the move e5. So this is a fork because we have a singular piece, which is attacking two pieces at the same time. And in this instance, these two pieces happen to be undefended. And whichever piece white moves, most likely black will be capturing the other piece on the next move. For example, say the bishop goes away, then we can simply take the knight. We've managed to win a full knight. And if the knight moves away, same situation, but this time we just capture the bishop. And what I mean by pieces being defended, that could be in a position like this, for example. So now you'll see that these two pieces are technically defended by pawns each. There, by pawns each, but we can still play this move e5 because even though the pieces are defended by other pieces, we're using a pawn which is worth 1 point to attack two pieces which are both worth 3 points respectively. So same situation, no matter which piece white moves, once we take and white takes back, you'll realize that we traded a pawn for a knight. So we traded 1 point for our opponent's 3 points, so that is advantageous for us. And similar story, if the knight moves away, then we take the bishop, and after white takes back, we still traded 1 point for 3 points, just except this time it's with a bishop. So that's an example of a fork with a pawn. And also I would mention that the fork can be done with pretty much any piece. Any piece in chess can basically do a fork. A pawn can do a fork when it's attacking 2 pieces diagonally. A bishop can also do it when 2 pieces are on the same diagonal. A knight can do it when there's 2 pieces, obviously, an L shape away. And a rook can do it if 2 pieces are on the same file here. A queen can also do it, similar to how a rook or a bishop does it. And a king can do it if 2 pieces are right beside each other. So now I'll show an example of the queen doing a fork. So these are just some opening moves. So here is an example of another fork. Although this is technically better for white, but just for the sake of showing what a fork is, this is another example of a fork where basically we're attacking the king here. And then we are forking 2 pawns as well. So obviously we're probably going to be able to win a pawn, although this position is still better for white, but just to show what a fork is. And then we will show one more example of a fork. Let's see, so in this situation, this is another example of a fork. This time we are using the queen again to fork the king and pretty much a piece. So this is an example of a fork again, where we're attacking the king and we're also simultaneously attacking the bishop. And you'll notice that there's no way to block this check in a way where we can protect this bishop. And there's no way for basically the piece that we're attacking to block the check either. So what I mean by that is if we go back to this example right here, say we do something like this. So same situation. We'll play a couple more moves. So in a situation like this, although it looks like we are attacking the king and the bishop, this is an example of where we can block with the piece that is also attacked in the fork. So this bishop, although it's attacked, we can see that it can retreat back to d2 in order to block this check and also get this bishop out of the way. And another example of this could be in a situation like this. So right here, although it looks like we have a fork with the move queen to a5 here, this is indeed a fork. However, there are ways to defend it, including playing the move knight to c3. So knight to c3, it blocks this check and also protects this bishop at the same time. And although this knight is currently pinned, you'll notice that if we go and take this bishop, because if we think this knight is pinned, then it's a fake defender, as I mentioned. But you'll notice that once we take the bishop, that this knight is no longer pinned because the queen is no longer on this diagonal, and white can actually take back. So those are the 2 ways to kind of defend a fork. There's obviously there's also a third way, which is if your king is in check and you move it to defend this attack piece. So just as a very wild example, say something like this were to occur, and here we give a check. This obviously isn't a normal position, but just to illustrate, this is a fork of the bishop and the king, but obviously the king can step forward to c4 if it wants to defend this bishop as well. So those are kind of the 3 ways to defend a fork, which is to play a piece that blocks the check as well as defends the piece simultaneously that's attacked. The other way is that we move the attacked piece to defend a check, let's say, or to defend the other piece that is attacked. And the third way is obviously, well, with the king, we can step it forwards, as I mentioned the example previously, to defend the attacked piece. And the other thing I'll add with forks is that usually in the opening, forks happen with usually the king as well as another piece, but forks can also happen between 2 pieces, as we showed with this example, where the fork happened with the bishop as well as the knight. So a fork can pretty much happen to any single piece and can also be done by any piece. So that's a general example as well as how the fork works. Now we'll look at a couple of examples where they happen in real games. So we have 5 examples here like yesterday. So we'll look at the first one. This is with, so the player with white was able to win this. So these are just some opening moves. we'll skip ahead to the end. This game was relatively quick actually because of the fork tactic. So here, black played the move bishop to d6, and white was able to take advantage of these two pieces because they were both loose and they weren't defended by anything. So white played the move queen to d1. The idea is shown with the arrows, basically. These two pieces, as I mentioned, are both undefended, and they're what we call loose pieces pretty much. So we're able to attack both of these pieces at the same time, and there is no way for black to basically defend them both at the exact same time with a move. For example, queen to h4 defends the knight, but doesn't defend the bishop. A move like queen to e7 defends the bishop, but it doesn't defend the knight. Oh, queen to h4 on the board as well. It defends the knight, but it doesn't protect the bishop. And let's say we move the knight away, then we can simply take this bishop. And if we move the bishop away, then we can simply take this knight and we are up a piece. And this is actually a game at a very high level. It is actually at a world-class level. So it shows that still these tactics, no matter what tactics they are, they can happen at any level and can happen to anyone. In fact, the player with black was actually a former world champion. So shows it can happen to anyone. This is the second example. So we'll skip ahead here. So in this position right here, so you notice that the bishop's attacking the rook moves out of the way. And here after queen to d7, the player with black, actually the current world champion, plays this very stunning move. Queen takes d1. So this actually involves multiple forks technically at this in basically a combination of moves in order to actually win this queen at the end, which we'll see how. So here you'll see that black has just won a rook with this move. Queen takes rook and is attacking the king and technically also attacking the bishop. So this is technically a fork. Obviously we can take the queen. If we don't, then we're down a rook. So we better see what happens here. Rook to e1. This is another fork. We're attacking the king and the bishop at the same time. And then after the king steps forward to g2, that is the only move. Black played bishop to f1 to attack the king. So now there are a couple of moves for white here. White can step backwards onto the h file as well as step forward onto f3. So we'll look at the worst option first. So g1, king to g1 or king to h1 both lead to the same result. There is simply checkmate at 1 with bishop to h3. This is a discovered checkmate. Reason being, bishop on h3 now covers g2, and the rook here covers the back rank, the h1, g1, and f1 squares. So this would be checkmate. H1 leads to the same thing. So white steps forward with the king to not get checkmated immediately. And now we see how we can win the queen. We can play the move knight to e5 check. Knight to e5 check is another fork. We fork the king and the queen this time. And white steps forwards because white's in check. And then once we take the queen, you'll see that white is in another fork again. This time the two bishops are attacked at the same time. So this bishop on d1 is attacked, as well as this bishop on c5 is attacked by the knight. So after white moves the bishop, one of the bishops, doesn't matter which one, we'll take the other one anyways. Here, we can simply take the other bishop, and you'll realize that black has an extra rook and a knight, while both sides do have a bishop, but a rook and a knight at any level is highly winnable. So white actually resigned after the very stunning move, queen takes d1. And what's funny is that the move queen to d7 is the reason why this whole sequence works. Say the queen went to another square like a7, let's say. Let's say the queen went to another square like a7, then this whole sequence doesn't work anymore. Because here you'll realize that knight to e5 check doesn't actually do anything because there's no queen on d7. So it's quite interesting how a slight move that's like a lot of squares away from the king, not that arrow, but a lot of squares away from the king basically can actually result in a blunder in which the knight is able to fork the king and the queen some moves later. After this whole sequence, which involves a lot of forks, we're able to win the queen and basically a bishop and a lot of pieces pretty much, and we're able to win this game. So that's the second example. Third example we have, this one again, we'll skip to the end. So we'll skip to here. So here we see actually a pin that we learned yesterday. The rook is pinned to the king, and this is an absolute pin. And then here we jump forward the piece. Here we attack the pin piece, sort of just reviewing what we learned yesterday. And then in this position, this is where the fork took place. So here the player with the white pieces played a very, very nice move. They moved queen to h8 check. On the surface, it looks like we're giving away a queen. However, it is not simply that. We're actually completely winning here for white. Reason being, we're taking advantage of the fact that this knight is able to take this rook. And if this king were on h8, we would be able to take the g5 queen, or the queen on g5. So in this position, if the king was on h8, let's say this type of a position happened. The queen's here. Let's say this position happened, then obviously white is able to take the f7 rook, fork the king and the queen, and well, we're simply up a queen as well as a knight, so we should win this. So what white did was he forced black into basically making their king go to h8 because, well, king takes h8 is the only move. And then afterwards, we can play knight takes f7, check. This is a fork, forking the king and the queen. And then once the king moves to g7, g8, doesn't really matter. We can simply take the queen, and you'll see we're up a knight here. So that is another example of a fork, this time involving actually a queen sacrifice. The fourth example we have, this is one that is relatively quick early on in the game, move 11 around. And here, firstly, we'll start off with this move. So here, white plays the move knight takes on f5. So the idea of knight takes on f5 is, let's say black takes back, she takes on f5. So firstly, there's ideas on the e file here to attack the king, although that's a bit advanced. The secondary, or technically the primary idea here is we have the move queen to d5. Queen to d5, it actually is a fork as well. It attacks the rook in the corner, and it also attacks this pawn, but technically once we take this pawn, this would actually be checkmate. So let's say black blocks with a piece. I know this gives away a piece, but just to illustrate, then queen takes f7 is checkmate. All the squares are covered by the queen in some capacity, so that would be checkmate. So that is the reason why we can't take this knight. Black plays another move. And here it's actually quite interesting. White actually purposely goes into a fork in order to give a fork. So let's look at all the possibilities here. So black, obviously, there's two pieces hanging for white. Let's take a look at what happens if you take the knight. Then, well, you would lose your rook. And also, as I mentioned before, there is an open king here, so we can maybe attack it. And then if you take the bishop, then we can simply recapture with the queen. And similar situation, this knight is undefended, this rook is undefended, and there's no way to defend both pieces at the same time. So that is, and also the bishop going to d5, the initial threat is, as you can see with the arrows, to attack the rook on a8, as well as the knight on e4, because both of these pieces are undefended. So let's say after this, since black did technically gain a piece, let's say black moves the rook out of the way, then we regain our piece. And obviously here, we can play the move bishop to e3, attacking the rook. So the rook probably has to move. And the rook can go to c7. b7 is off limits, and a8 as well, because our queen slices through. Rook to c7, then that runs into bishop to b6. This is actually a pin that we learned yesterday. So we're combining different tactics in games, as you see. The rook is technically pinned to the queen, although we can take this rook pretty much on the next move or whenever, because we're trading technically the bishop for a rook, so this is good for us anyways. And the other square that black can go to is rook to d7. But there's a lot of different ideas here. And also in general, black's position is just really, really tied down. Basically, in chess, obviously, with opening stuff, we try to get our king safe as early as possible. But in this position, it doesn't look like black can castle. There is actually no way for black to castle because black has moved both rooks. Both of these rooks have moved, and this king basically has no shelter. There's a lot of open space basically for white's pieces to jump into. For example, like the b6 to attack the rook. There are a lot of ideas here, which we won't go into, but basically that would be a disastrous position for black. Let's see what other variation. So let's say knight f. So obviously, if we move the knight, then we can lose the rook in the corner. And here, let's say we take this knight, then we actually don't take the rook, because then if we take the rook, you'll realize that we lost both a knight and a bishop in the center for the price of a rook. And a knight and a bishop for a rook is usually a bad trade for the side that only got a rook. So that's why we actually take the bishop instead. Although we're down a piece, we're actually threatening checkmate here on f7. So to illustrate, queen takes f7 is checkmate because all of the squares are taken. So instead here, black would probably defend. And then here we realize that we can actually take the knight, because this is another fork here, because we're forking technically f7 as well as the knight on e4. So there's a lot of forks in this position and a lot of tactics that are brewing. So rook a7, then afterwards, like I mentioned, black's position is just really passive. So we won't go into any more detail, but that's sort of how black's position would fall. So in the game, black played rook a7 to get the rook out of the way. Once we take the knight, black regains their piece. And we'll go as far as around here. Although white, after basically this very nice tactic here, did have a better position, white was unfortunately unable to convert this game and actually ended up losing, but we won't go into that. But sort of the bishop to d5 is the main idea I wanted to show. So that is the fourth example. And our final example for today is this position for black. In this position, black played the move rook to e4. The idea with rook e4 is to disconnect the communication of this rook on f4 to the rook on d4. You'll see that before, these two rooks are connected, so they're defending each other. But after the move rook e4, we cut this connection because of our rook in the middle, and white is going to lose a piece here. So let's look at what would happen if we capture. So if bishop takes e4, then simply we can take with either pawn. There's f takes e4, d takes e4, they're the same thing. If f takes e4, then we attack both rooks. There's still, the connection between the two is still disconnected because of this pawn on e4. So we would be able to win a rook. And if we take with the other pawn, it's the same thing, just except now we took with the d pawn. So yep. And let's take a look at it if we take with a rook. If we take with a rook, then we can take with either pawn. This is an example of pretty much we have a lot of choices. If d takes e4, then we're attacking this bishop on d3 with the pawn. And we're also attacking this rook here on f4 with our king. So white will lose out on a piece because we're forking with two pieces at the same time. We can also take with the other pawn, same situation. And if you take with the other rook, you can take with either pawn, up to you. And we're attacking the bishop as well as the rook. And if we take with the other pawn, same situation. King is attacking the rook, pawn is attacking the bishop. So this is actually an example of what a fork can, technically speaking, not be done by one piece, but technically done by two. But the fork was really initiated with a singular move. So that can also happen for a fork. So we still define this as a fork, even though technically two pieces are attacking two pieces at the same time. In general, a fork is just when two pieces of your opponents are sort of attacked at the same time and they kind of have to move one in order, and they would lose the other one, or something of that sort. So those are a couple of examples of forks in real games. Now we'll do a couple of practices and then we'll split into breakout rooms. So I'll present my screen again. All right, this is white to move. I'll check the chat. Okay, queen a4, that's a great try. Queen a4 does look like we check the king as well as attack this knight on c4 because we notice that there's already a bishop there. The only issue with queen to a4, however, is that black actually has the move bishop to d7. And since this knight is defended by another knight, we obviously can't take first with the queen because then we would lose a queen. So we have to take it with the bishop first. But if we take with the bishop, then you'll notice that the bishop is able to capture our queen on a4, which is why queen a4 isn't the correct first move. However, queen a4 is involved in the tactic. The hint I'll give is that since we already know queen a4 is the fork move basically to attack the two pieces, is there a different move order we can do this so that when bishop d7 is played, we're able to take on c4 with the queen instead?
Rook to b8.
Rook to b8 is an interesting try. The only issue with rook b8 is that there's simply rook takes b8, and we would be losing out on a rook. But that's a good try. Rook b7 is also an interesting try. However, there is bishop takes b7. So
Rook to b2.
rook b2 is also interesting, but there is knight takes b2. So as Zoe pointed out earlier, we're trying to get queen a4 to work in order to attack the king as well as be able to win the knight. The issue with queen a4 right now is that there's bishop to d7 attacking our queen. So how can we sort of I'll check the chat. Bishop to f4, that is a way to try to get rid of the knight on e5 to stop protecting the c4 knight, because we're trying to play bishop takes f4. The only issue with bishop f4 is that black can't play moves directly like bishop d7 or castles. So instead, I'll say when we're trying to get rid of this knight or make this knight move somehow, we have to try to look for the most forcing moves to make that happen. So that involves checks, captures, as well as attacks. And I would say checks right now, the only check is queen a4, but queen a4 doesn't work currently. So next thing we should look at is captures.
Pawn to f4.
Pawn to f4 is also an interesting try. Pawn to f4. Pawn to f4, let's see. The only issue with pawn to f4 is that black can actually take on d3, and that's actually check. And then, well, obviously we don't want to lose a bishop. So after queen takes on d3, this knight can simply move away to b6, for example, and there wouldn't necessarily be a fork in the position. Okay, I'll reveal the solution in, we'll say a minute, and yeah. Okay, I'll give one final hint. So since this knight is currently defending this knight, is there a way we can remove one of the knights from the board entirely?
Take the knight with the d3 pawn.
You mean the d3 bishop?
Yeah. Oh yeah, my bad. Yeah,
Yeah,
the
that's
bishop.
good. That's
Yeah.
good. Yeah, so bishop takes on c4, that is the correct first move. And after knight takes c4, now what should we play? Keep in mind now that if the bishop does counterattack our queen, we don't have to, this knight isn't defended by anything, so the queen can take it directly.
You move the queen to b3.
Queen to b3, that's a good try. That does attack the knight. However, it's not the most forcing move. Now we have to look at, now we can look at checks as well. So Queen to b3 does attack the knight, but the knight can simply move away. Okay, the final hint I'll give is that this move has already been suggested. Yeah, that's correct. Queen a4, it is indeed the correct move. Reason being, now bishop d7, although it attacks our queen, this knight on e5 doesn't exist anymore, so the knight on c4 is technically already undefended, so we can just simply take with the queen. And I'll illustrate why we couldn't play queen a4 immediately. Queen a4 here, there's bishop d7, so we can't take with the queen here, because if queen takes, then after knight takes, you realize that we got 2 pieces for the queen, which isn't sufficient material because of the point system. So here, the correct move order for capturing would, of course, be bishop takes. But if bishop takes, then there's bishop takes on a5. And after all of this, you'll realize that we only got a piece for the queen. So that definitely isn't enough, which is why we had to remove one of these knights first, so that when we play queen a4 check, this piece was undefended. Because when we play queen a4, black can block and counterattack our queen. So once we take and queen a4 check, you'll see that the knight on c4 is now undefended, which is why we can play bishop to d7. When black plays bishop to d7, there's queen takes c4, there's no knight protecting, so this capture is okay. So for the sake of time, we'll be doing that one for practice together, and we'll split into breakout rooms now to practice with the other tutors as well. So I'll split you guys into breakout rooms and have fun.